Hello everyone, keeping busy here, and today I have something slightly different for you, something that harkens back to my old kind of content. I have a custom game slash exploration of a interesting Minecraft concept. And for those of you who are astute enough to have looked in my hotbar or directly in front of us, you'll probably have a prediction as to what we're going to be talking about today. But the other interesting thing you may have noticed is these things around me, specifically this sign, which reveals where we are. This is in fact a hub server I have created, where you can come on and participate in parkour, combat, puzzles, and mini-games to earn currency and compete with others. So if you think this looks interesting, a very small, blossoming hub server where you can come and stake your claim, go ahead and check the description to come join my hub Discord where you can find the IP. Or if you just want to join the Discord so you can participate in other projects, that's also a great idea. Now, with that plugged on, you may be able to hear my cat meowing below me, and her jingling as she runs away. But with that plug over with, let's go ahead and get into this project right here. So, yes, these are the blocks that are at the center of it all. Most of you should know what these are ahead of time, but for those of you who don't, these are known as coral blocks, a relatively recent addition to Minecraft in the grand scheme of things that have a very, very, very interesting and very useful behavior. You see, there are blocks in Minecraft that update over time, but coral blocks have the interesting concept of they will invariably change from one block to another block. Blocks like leaves, for instance, any kind of leaf will change without logs nearby. They will die, for instance, but when they die, they don't change into dead leaves, they change into air. They disappear entirely, and there is no difference between them. For coral, let's go ahead and grab this as well. If I place a horn coral block and wait long enough, it will always change to dead horn coral. And if I place tube coral next to it, it will always change to dead tube coral. See, slightly different but very similar. Now this is the key part of how this mechanic can be utilized. You see, the two things to remember are one, any kind of coral will always turn into its respective related dead coral, and two, the amount of time it takes for any coral to change shape is not the same. I place those blocks from left to right, but they change sporadically. They didn't change in the same order. That's because there is a random timer, a random interval of seconds for how long it will take for coral to die. Now, that timer isn't very long. From the time it takes for the first one to die, the last one dies just a couple seconds later, maybe 2, maybe just barely 3. But that duration, because it's randomized, allows for some very interesting outcomes. If all coral died as soon as it spawned, if I placed 2 coral right next to each other, these would both die at the same time, and it would greatly limit what we could do with it. There's still options since we know what block they're going to turn into, but it still removes some capability. So those are the two behaviors of coral that allow it to be used differently than another block. But then there's a third aspect which involves interactability. Because as right now, the only way we can affect how long it takes for coral to die is when we place it. Obviously, since coral dies very quickly when related to each other, the interval of time for randomness is only, let's say, a second, maybe 2. I'm going to revise my answer from earlier. The only thing we can do to change the time is wait a longer duration before placing the second one. Because I waited longer, I almost guarantee the second one will die second. The first one will die first, the second one will die second. Essentially, there is an overlap of the intervals. The closer that you put them together, the more likely one is to die before the other one. See? Exactly as demonstrated. So, how else can we affect this? Well, look at this thing in my hand. It's a water bucket. Now again, for those of you who are familiar with coral, the other interesting aspect of them is that coral will die unless water is placed in some spot that borders them. See, if I place one coral here and one coral here, this coral will survive because it has access to water, while this coral will die. Now this is where player interactability and the potential for games drastically increases. Now, all you have to really do for a game is place down coral, I guess I replaced that already, is place down coral and allow players to place down water on top of them to keep them alive. Now, with just one type of coral, that wouldn't be very fun for very long. It would only take so long for all the coral to die, maybe 5-10 seconds, and with water disappearing, that game would be very interesting. But that's where some commands come in, and these command blocks over here are the key to it. Now, remember how earlier I said that every block of coral will change to its respective dead form when it dies. Horn coral turns to dead horn coral, tube to dead tube, brain to dead brain, bubble to dead bubble, and fire to dead fire. Because we can predict what each type will die to, well, become when it dies, however you want to phrase that, we can choose what to do with it. See, we know that dead horn coral will appear when horn coral dies, so we'll replace any dead horn coral with tube coral, the second one in the list, blue. Then, I'm pretty sure you can predict here, dead tube will turn into living brain, and then dead brain will turn into living bubble, then dead bubble will turn into living fire. Now, for my minigame that I'm developing here, I have this clock, which is designed to give you water buckets and sponges to affect the rate at which the coral dies. As such, the very last block typically results in the dead fire becoming air and disappearing and allowing gaps in the arena. But for our purposes today and for some interesting demonstrations, I've decided to loop it back to the top, where when fire dies, it turns into horn and goes back to the beginning of the list. So while that's for a minigame, this is very interesting in terms of demonstrating what's going on. So I guess the big thing to do is to hit the button and start explaining what's happening. So we start with a layer of horn coral, and as it all dies, it turns to tube. As that all dies, it turns to brain. As that all dies, it turns, I always forget this name, to bubble. And then as bubble dies, it turns to fire. And then finally, as fire dies, it turns back to yellow. So that was a one cycle. Let me restart it so I can talk about it again. So looking at this from above, you can see that all of the blue overtakes the yellow before any pink shows up. Now, that's kind of interesting. However, on the second turn, the pink couldn't overtake the blue before purple showed up. And now, purple couldn't overtake pink before red showed up. And now, you can kind of see the pattern, blue is showing up when there's still quite a bit of red, and now blue is showing up when pink is showing up when there's still quite a bit of yellow, purple is showing up when there's still quite a bit of blue, and this is going to continue. We started with only having one color on the field with yellow. That quickly changed as soon as even one blue showed up. But then we had two colors, and now we're getting up to 3 colors at a time, and we're just barely pushing it to 4. As you can see, those pink started to come in just as red started to die off. Now, I won't get into the mathematics of this, but it all basically links back to the fact that I always say horn coral, it's such an unfortunate one to be using as an example, but because of the fact that coral dies at different rates, it causes that random pattern to occur, and it causes each block's own, let's say, cycle to offset. Now, if I take only 2 blocks and I put them in here, you can see that at the start, they're going to start changing relatively close to each other. The one can only get so far ahead of the other one. Right now, this one is ahead, but this one can catch up with a couple lucky rolls. But of course, right now, it's waiting pretty far behind it. That one, it caught up a little bit because this one took longer and this one took shorter, and now the gap is closed a little bit more. Now this continues for a while, and eventually if we watch this long enough, it's possible that this one could get an entire step ahead of the other one, and now this one's overtaken this one, see? Or it could be that these two remain on the same level forever. It all has to do with the random time that it takes for each one to change. Let's say, for instance, that the maximum amount of time difference that there can be for a change is 1 second. This isn't the case, obviously, but let's say that it could take 5 to 6 seconds for each change. So that means that at maximum, every time a block changes, it can only gain a second of time over the other block. Let's say that this block takes 5 seconds to change and this one takes 6. Now this one's 1 second ahead of it. But then on the next change, this one takes another 5 and this one takes another 6. Now it's 2 seconds ahead of it. But of course, that's immediately undone the second that this one happens to take 5 seconds and this one takes 6 seconds. And that basically continues as these blocks continue to try to overtake one another and offset the pattern. Right now, we're a little bit ahead here. This one's got a pretty good lead on this one, just a couple decent rolls, and it's possible that this one will overjump an entire block ahead of it. But the The reason that the change isn't drastic is because there is such a little amount of time that can be gained on each change. And again, that change is completely lost if the other block happens to get a lucky roll in the next one. In order to get something, let's say, like using the 5 to 6 example, in order to change an entire cycle before someone else, you would have to, at minimum, get a 5-second lead, which means you would have to beat your opponent by the maximum possible 5 times in a row without the other one getting any lucky rolls to gain time back on you. Obviously, that's not the case, and so it'll take dozens, if not hundreds, of continual changes for one of these blocks to drastically overjump the other one. Now, the reason we saw that here is because we had, I think, somewhere 100 to 200 test cases running at once. That means that we're probably seeing the best of the best versus the worst of the worst, and we're more likely to have that difference show up. So that's kind of a mathematical explanation to show why the pattern starts varying more and more and more and more. Now, as a last little thing before I close off, let's go ahead and talk about the water mechanics. Now you can see that the blocks all change, but if I happen to place a water bucket, you'll see that the area underneath that bucket, it took a while for the water to get out, becomes frozen in time. Essentially, I've stopped, let me get a sponge to be able to clear this up easily. I've stopped the progression of any of the blocks underneath this water. The second that is a coral block, the second I take that water away, those blocks resume their cycle, but now I've offset them. Essentially, I've allowed the entire rest of it to continue one cycle ahead of them, and now these blocks are essentially just very slightly ahead of everything else. So that's where the minigame aspect of this comes in. Imagine that every time that the red died, it didn't go back to yellow, it instead disappeared entirely. You would use the water buckets and the sponges to create safe havens and platforms, and destroy other players' platforms in order to create openings. Now you can see these giant splotches that are being created. Essentially, I'm creating a Pollock painting using these big, wide water areas. You can see where I've placed the water from previous rounds. So that's the interesting aspect of water and how it can affect this. So with all of that being said, I hope to have not bored you too much, but it's just an interesting thing where if you can find a interesting mechanic of a game, such as Minecraft, you can capitalize it to create something very special. Now to end it off, I'm going to go ahead and do a quick time lapse of about 5 minutes of this running to see just how varied and wild we can get the pattern with that amount of time. I hope you ever had a great day. Goodbye.